Hi, my name is Vickie Fairchild. Today I want to talk about the acronyms or abbreviations that are used in special education that are often a little frustrating, or a better way for me to describe it is people think they know what they mean and maybe they don't, or are very confident in their definition of these acronyms or these abbreviations. So the first one is the IEP, or the Individual Education Plan. Okay, so we throw around the word IEP all the time. We're having an IEP meeting, this is the annual IEP, triennial IEP. But I want us to look at what this IEP is supposed to be. And the word that I think we neglect to think a lot about is individual. It is very easy in special ed to come up with typical, not individual, typical education plans. And I discovered this early on in my career as I worked at different school sites and with different resource teachers, and it was you could almost guess what the services were going to be depending on who the resource teacher was. Now, every teacher, and I don't want that to sound as a criticism, but I found that fascinating that as a psychologist, I was testing kids who were very similar in maybe their type of learning issue or learning disability. And if I was at one school site, the child would get this level of service. And if I was at another school site, the child would get that level of service. And it was pretty consistent among the teachers. Now, we all do this, but that type of programming neglects to consider the individual nature that an IEP should be. So I want to encourage special educators the next time you are developing an individual education plan to ask yourself if you are really focusing on the individual. Now I know it's hard. But that is one area where I think we could work on a little bit. The next two, I developed the two acronyms. I developed a little bit of an issue with as I progressed in my career. And that is because I came to understand that these two are not very well defined, but people like to act like they're very well defined and that we actually know what they mean. Now, going back to a video I did about how young special ed is, I want to point out again that I am older than the first special education law in the United States. I am older. I'm not that old. So as we continue to figure out this law, these two terms are still being defined. And if anyone tells you differently, they're lying. Or they just don't know. Or they assume, because you can be in there with an administrator who acts like they know exactly what these words mean. These are still being defined in the courts. And as parents and schools push these issues to get better clarity of what they mean, we are learning more and more what they mean, but we still have a long ways to go. So here we go. Here's this one. Least Restrictive Environment. People like to say LRE, 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 and parents are like, what's LRE? LRE means Least Restrictive Environment. What in the heck does Least Restrictive Environment mean? I mean, who even talks that way? Sorry. I've never, except in special ed, used this term. So least. So the small, you think least, smallest. restrictive environment. So you're thinking of, they say the least restrictive environment for a child with disabilities that's restricting him from is general ed. 100% in general ed. So general education is considered to be the least restrictive environment if you don't have a disability. Then we need to determine what that least restrictive environment looks like. And again, it's not that well defined. Some people like to put a special ed teacher and a general ed teacher's an environment, call it co-teaching, and say that's the least restrictive environment. Not necessarily the case. The least restrictive environment is I like to think of it, and again, this is my definition, of the environment where the child can be the most independent and the supports that are necessary for that child to be independent. However, some parents out there might define it differently. I have had some parents that have shown me different ways to look at the least restrictive environment. I have seen kids thrive in general education classrooms with an aid that allows them to access that general education curriculum. And for those parents, that is how they define the least restrictive environment for their child. Other parents have found the least restrictive environment to be a special day class, or depending on how your state defines it, or just a separate class for children with disabilities. And that may be the least restrictive environment for that child. This is an IEP team decision. And again, this is not necessarily defined by law. We want children to be educated together as much as possible. And depending on the disability, depending on the level of the child, depending on a lot of things, this least restrictive environment can change. Now, one of the things that I have seen in my career is how least restrictive environment is defined differently between schools, just like an IEP, and districts. I've had parents who have contacted me changing districts and say, wait, this new district does da-da-da-da-da. I thought my child was going to receive this. And while generally they're not that different, sometimes they are so different that it can cause a special educator to go, were we offering the least restrictive environment? Or maybe we were offering a more restrictive environment that we shouldn't have been doing. Something to think about. But again, this is a tricky term. It's a tricky term, and it should be decided. It's not formulaic, and it's still not well defined. Okay, the one that goes hand in hand with least restrictive environment that special educators need to be very, very careful about assuming they understand is FAPE. How many have you FAPE? We throw that one around. Okay, now let's look at what FAPE stands for. FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. Okay, the tricky thing about FAPE is this. We know what free means. You and I know what free means. It means I don't have to pay for it. We know what public education means. But what does appropriate mean? Again, this goes hand in hand with least restrictive environment. What does appropriate mean? Now, this is the one that's really starting to hit the courts. Because some school districts will go, whoa, this is appropriate. And a parent will say, no, 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 that's not an appropriate education for my child. But again, this is happening because special ed is so young. It's so young. We haven't figured all these out. We're still figuring all these out. So I want to encourage special educators, when you get those questions from parents about the appropriateness of what you're asking for, or you're providing, or your plan, don't take offense, because this is all still pretty new. Remember, you're developing an individual education plan, not a formulaic one that's for that child, that's supposed to help them make progress and educational progress. Yes, it should be in the least restrictive environment, but what does that mean? What does that mean for that child, that family, that parent, that school? What is that least restrictive environment? It's not a formula. And finally, appropriate. What does appropriate mean for this situation? Appropriate could mean general education with an aid. Appropriate could mean special education class with an aid. Appropriate could mean ABA therapy. Appropriate could mean extra speech therapy. Appropriate could mean specific therapy to deal with dyslexia. Appropriate could mean a lot of things, but it needs to be appropriate to the individual student. Early in my career, we had a changeover in directors, and it was quite a shock. And as the focus changed, not from looking at what was appropriate for the child, but how to save money. And that's how it felt like us in the field. It was very hard. And I remember having many conversations with this director where she would assert, we don't have to provide Cadillac education. There are a lot of words I cannot say about how I felt about that attitude towards developing an IEP plan, to developing an individual program for a child with a disability. It didn't last and it didn't work, because children need an appropriate education. And if you're justifying the withholding of services because you don't want to provide a Cadillac one, you need to take a good hard look in the mirror. A good hard look in the mirror. Because what parents and children need us to do is to try to figure out those gray areas of special ed and do what we can in that individual education plan, in the least restrictive environment, to give them an appropriate education so they can progress, so that they can meet their goals, so that they can grow as human beings, and so that they can celebrate their successes. Let's try to do that. And as we learn those words, as we further define those words, let's be willing to be nimble and adjust to what we learn in special education as our laws are continuing to be defined.